Staying alive in Path of Exile 2 is almost as important to playing softcore as it is to hardcore. And my goal in running a monk through the hardcore campaign enough times to make me ill is to fully develop one of the pathways to reliably achieving this. I think can be followed by anyone, including solo self-found players. What this means for the context of the guide is there are no required uniques, no recommended supports above the level you can find, and you really only need one lesser jeweler's orb to start mapping. First, some general tips that apply all the way through to the endgame. I've been using Exiled Exchange to check things on trade site and make my life a bit easier. Keeping a stack or two of ID scrolls or even transmutes in your inventory will allow you to ID and craft quickly and go to town less often, and a filter for picking up relevant white and blue items is included in the planners in the description. Check vendors every level. They'll reset and present a lot of opportunities for upgrades or items with quality you can salvage. Lastly, you can pause and manage your inventory and skills on the fly. This is obvious on controller, but PC players can do this by going to the passive screen first. And these are mostly opinions, but I personally find controller much less taxing to play on, and paddle buttons allow very responsive potion use. Secondly, I do not recommend gambling early in a character's lifespan when it taps into vital gold you'll need to respec and buy out good vendor finds. Its next section is aimed at overcoming a fresh start. I level his range until around the middle of Act 2, melee is just too dangerous with no upside until then. I use a crossbow to level because the sheer amount of attack speed Monk gets at the start makes them fun to use. However, it's impossible to beat Lightning Arrow and Stormcaller Arrow when you don't have supports. The game has very few supports and equipment drops at the start, so you may just have to slap wolves around with Frozen Locust and Falling Thunder for a bit, or farm Beira until a suitable weapon drops. Alternatively, for very little currency, you can breeze through most of Act 1 with a Mist Whisper. This is very common, and should stay pretty cheap because it's very hard to make use of in an endgame build. A definite strategy for using your currencies on items at the stage can be hard to implement. You'll have the best idea of how to use them after you're familiar with item bases and mod tiers relative to your level. You can check mod tiers on controller by clicking the right stick, and on PC by hovering over an item and pressing Alt. I'll give examples of evaluating items to upgrade later on in the video. You can check out Sir Gog's currency guide for more detailed info. Once you have your first crossbow and some supports, you're ready to go. The first batch of crossbow skills really do not feel good to use without investment. Because of this, the build uses the crossbow basic attack as a core skill for early clear with Pierce and Martial Tempo for supports, and early bossing with Pierce and Scattershot. Scattershot turns it into a 3-round burst rather than a typical spread, which can be great for damage and taking advantage of short opportunity windows. Martial Tempo and Pierce are also excellent lightning arrow supports, so they're good transferable first picks if you're stuck to that route for a bit. Scattershot seems to have some hidden thresholds where it goes from decent to excellent, so if it's not effective for a particular situation, you can rotate in Martial Tempo or Lightning Infusion to go back to single shot and vice versa. I take Herald of Thunder as my first Spirit gem because it synergizes extremely well with Galvanic Shards. Spirit in general is not a huge priority for me because Wind Dancer and Ghost Dance need a lot more evasion than I have currently to do anything, and if you do find extra Spirit on equipment, it's helpful, but don't sacrifice for it. This section is a detailed look at early defense for those struggling to pick their equipment. First, it'll be easier if you grab an energy shield chest, since even the base amounts will be enough to pad your chances. Manual dodging, along with enough evasion, will avoid most of the damage in Act 1, so if I find a chest that brings my evasion to 70% or more, I'll wear it as long as my life total and energy shield total will stay high enough. In blunt terms, this means 4 to 500 combined health and energy shield by the end of Act 1, and this will increase by roughly 300 per act. Body runes can help with this, but the window where they provide more value than resistance runes will close around Act 2. Generally, you always want to have life in the back of your mind when considering upgrades, but movement speed on boots and damage and attack speed on gloves might be worth giving priority. Unifying these principles for me often results in a pure evasion chest and energy shield bases in the other slots, but finding a worthwhile or even exceptional hybrid energy shield and evasion chest is difficult but not impossible. Elemental resistances are usually good around 30% if you follow the info from before, and most of the difficult bosses have a particular element you can emphasize for the fight. Uniques are never required, but Sure-Footed Sigil and Wanderlust are good quality of life items if you find them early. Iron Rings are also good early, but will soon be outclassed by any kind of resistance ring you can find. Strength on gear will save you from detouring on the tree, and an Amber Amulet is often enough to carry the entire crossbow leveling phase in this regard. Any crossbow will get you started, but if you have 2 Artificer Orbs and 2 flat elemental damage runes, it's enough to blast through Act 1, so this is a good goal to farm out from the first few areas. For an example of what might be suitable for that, I'll deconstruct the logic behind crafting this level 10 crossbow that started as a blue item with T2 percentage physical damage. It was a good candidate for using Exalts on because T2 is as high as it goes at this item level, and the Regal gave another relevant modifier. There's not much more to it than that, so adding sockets and runes will make it viable for all of Act 1. For the passive tree, your early points will go to taking all these skill speed nodes up the flow state, along with a possible stat boost to the side to keep up with your crossbow strength requirement. Pathing to Step Like Mist provides early defense, and Essence of the Storm and Crashing Wave can be good detours for when you are waiting for enough points to reach something like Killer Instinct, which is a much better value. Level 14, you can cut Galvanic Shards from a quest, but level 5 Skill Gem can be worth trading for if you reach level 14 before that. This is great for clear, but awful for single target unless the target is very large, like the floor 1 Trial Boss or the Colossus. Fortunately, it's easy to switch back and forth between basic attack for a single target solution. Your support for Galvanic Shards is vital, and another good candidate is Lightning Infusion, but if you're not shocking much to trigger Herald of Thunder, Conduction will bridge that gap. At level 22, you can pick up Voltaic Mark and start considering the swap to Stormwave, depending on what kind of weapon you're able to find. Galvanic Shards is very good for farming Kesh if you get stuck here. At level 31, Hand of Chayula unlocks. This is the key to making melee feel smooth at this level, and despite the lowered effect, Take Mark and Conductivity are still quite useful for bossing and killing rares. These need to be slotted into the skill to function with it. A third slot can be occupied by Heightened Curse or eventually Hex Bloom. Other than providing debuffs, this skill moves you to enemies so fast that dashing and rolling behind the enemy or away from the enemy will pretty much always be a viable strategy for avoiding damage because it gives you more time between the attack animations starting and landing. Some of the most dangerous abilities in the game are only threatening when they target you approaching the boss normally. Silverback Slam and Black Jaw Slam come first to mind. Once you have 60 total spirit, either through the campaign or other means, add Wind Dancer to your skills and fill it with Maim and Blind to help manage crowds. General strategy for equipment does not change much at this stage, but you'll need to upgrade your flasks and equipment to keep your evasion high. At 33, you start to be able to access spaces and modifiers that are a significant upgrade over what's been available before, so it's a good time to spend orbs and gold if you've been saving. For passives at this stage, I'll talk about the most important one, Lucidity. Sometime before the Dreadnought, probably when you get to Morning Spires, you want to reconfigure your passives to take Lucidity. This will pad the build's defense in a way that feels very solid, and I would credit it with the build's high campaign success, even in the face of relatively low effective health totals. It only affects damage to life, so it works well with the high evasion and Ghost Shroud if you only have a moderate ES pool. At level 41, Shattering Palm becomes available and makes the build even smoother. Glaciation and Ice Blade give great damage in AoE clear, as well as consistently freezing non-bosses. This is where the build really starts to do heavy lifting regardless of your gear luck, because the extra 35% damage from Ice Bite goes a long way when it's applied to all of your abilities, and it will be up constantly if you use Shattering Palm for movement. If packs are feeling stubborn, then using Hand of Chayula with Voltaic Mark and Shattering Palm together will solve almost anything. Once you have 90 Spirit, the picks I'd recommend are Ghost Dance, Wind Dancer, and Herald of Thunder. You'll want even more Spirit as soon as possible for Combat Frenzy. When Combat Frenzy is feasible to add to your lineup, also add Charged Staff and take the Resonance Keystone at the same time to greatly enhance your clear. Grim Feast and Herald of Ice will round out the auras once Lead Me Through Grace gives you enough Spirit to fit them, though an unset ring is needed to fit all auras in both unarmed skills. Finishing up the endgame and fleshing out the build to prepare for maps will consist mostly of farming or buying good enough chests and getting resistances as high as possible. Values of 1000 evasion and higher start to become feasible around level 55 with an advanced studded fest, but the higher level you are, the less lucky you'll need to be to find good items. Capped elemental resistance of 75% is better, but 60% seems to be adequate to get started if you have at least 2 to 2.5 thousand total life and energy shield and are following the rest of the guide. You don't need much chaos resistance early on, but it'll become a factor later in maps. A good hybrid chest will always be the safest option for your max hit taken while bossing, but due to the bonus energy shield from Spectral Ward, you can substitute a high evasion chest for mapping. This allows you to have another item type to possibly get lucky on or to find a good deal on while trading, and having a very high evasion also makes taking Protect Me from harm feasible, which really helps make white mobs less dangerous even if you get swarmed. Eventually, you'll want as much energy shield as possible to survive boss hits, but while you are leveling and gearing, you can get away with comparatively little. Doing T15s felt fairly safe with 1.5 thousand health and 1.5 thousand base energy shield. For evaluating staves, it's hard to give a flat DPS number because of how heralds work in general. A very large part of the early endgame is clearing maps, where attack speed does not help nearly as much as extra herald damage, so a staff with a lot of attack damage will feel better in this respect than one with a lot of attack speed. The opposite is generally true for bossing. Ideally, this would encourage weapon swapping between a fast staff and a one with a lot of attack damage if you manage to find good candidates, but it hasn't been worth the trouble for me to do yet. And speaking of, these here are all roughly equivalent when it comes to clearing early maps. Our passive tree in this phase of the game should head towards Thin Ice and Heavy Frost, which complement Shattering Palm extremely well and help build the foundation for Shattering Palm's clear. Other than that, check the Maxwell Planner and path the nodes on it in the order you would need to, whether you want damage, or you need Dex or Martial Artistry, or to double your chest evasion with Bestial Skin, will depend on how your gear is progressing. Stormwave as an endgame skill with this setup is adequate until you start trying to do juice content like high tier Delirium, at which point you'll need to invest in other high-end sources of damage like Ingenuity and Rings, Attribute Stacking, or Hand of Wisdom in action. After all these things, however, the investment becomes similar to other builds, so there's no particular reason to stick with Stormwave. Stormwave is my favorite skill for leveling hardcore though, because it lets you engage from afar and navigate dicey situations without losing too much DPS uptime. The kiting ability and safety is unmatched in the world of melee. It'll always be great for getting things started on a fresh character, but the mana cost eventually can make investing into it without a gimmick like attribute stacking seem like a bad time. There are a lot of videos on the theory behind herald training, but if you're not getting satisfying explosions, there are a few quick steps I can tell you here to make sure your setup has the juice to make it happen. If you think it might be your weapon, see the section on endgame staves for how weapon choice within comparable DPS ranges can affect herald chaining. Area of effect is huge for making heralds feel good, and having a bit on jewels and through annoyance like shockwaves makes more of a difference than I would expect. Infamous and relatively expensive, Pulse Circuit will greatly ease the required damage and area of effect necessary for herald chaining at the cost of a ring slot, and it can get fairly expensive in hardcore. Linking Lightning Infusion and Cold Infusion to the opposite element heralds can help the general effect, but it's an extreme measure because it reduces damage. Monks can get 15% extra cold and lightning damage through the treat and passives, and with properly scaled damage everywhere else, it's usually enough. Herald of Ice and Thunder will produce smoother chains when they both have full quality, but Herald of Ice takes priority here. You can increase the AoE of Stormwave to make it longer and safer to use, making Trials 1 and 2 generally safe to do as they come up. You may want to wait for Trial 3 until the endgame, and Trial 4 when you are in red maps. I found Trial Master and the Ultimatum Trial to be easier to deal with for the 4th Ascendancy, but you'll want to look up an in-depth guide if you're having trouble. Information about endgame jewels you'll use for damage will be covered by whatever build guide you swap to after leveling, but I wanted to make a note of what you should look for to get started. Mana on kill is priority 1, but can be pretty expensive and rare. A jewel with rage on melee hit is hard to justify not taking. An area of effect will help most aspects of the build, but my strategy for the campaign in hardcore is to leave focusing on jewels for last so that I can buy or work on finding them with resistance corruptions to properly balance things. For Annoyance, Shockwaves is great all around. Generic increased area of effect is hard to come by in Monk, and this gives a boost to everything after an enemy stun. Enemies get lightly stunned relatively easily compared to being heavily stunned, so it's not a big hurdle. You can also get cheap damage from Smash, which lets you further exploit a heavy stun. Doomsayer can help boost clear, and it's always on, but it only affects heralds. With everything cleared up, hopefully, I'll finally wrap up the video. Drop your questions in the comments if you have them, and subscribe if you want to see more of my erratically paced content. Good luck, Exiles, and stay safe.